No Underdog Theology today, but I did want to put out something. So I'm going to be reacting to an interesting conversation between Russell Moore and Rick Warren, and also Ruslan. Ruslan did a video this past week, and I have some thoughts about some of the things that he had to say about female pastors. And that's really what this is focused on. This conversation between Rick Warren and Russell Moore was supposed to be about his legacy. And it quickly turned into, kind of looking at the SBC and how Rick Warren left. I shouldn't say left, he was forced out. And so they kind of commiserate on that because Russell Moore also felt that way because of some of the things that he faced in the SBC. And so I want to talk about the three things that Rick Warren said about female pastors and why it's biblical. And I kind of want to just react to some of those. So this is going to be a little bit choppy probably because it's a long interview and I want this video to be fairly short. But we're going to look at those points and then we'll look at what Ruslan concluded with, and we'll take a look at scripture as well. So let's hop into this.
In that study caused me to change my view about women. Nothing else could have studied it as I came upon three different scriptures. First,
the
Great Commission. Both men and women are to fulfill the Great Commission.
Yeah.
Well, not really. You don't believe that because it says there are four verbs in the Great Commission. Go, make disciples, baptize, and teach. Women are to go. Women are to make disciples. Women are to baptize. And women are to teach, not just men. Now, this is one of the reasons why Saddleback has baptized more people than any church in American history. 57,000 adult baptisms in 43 years. Why? Because in our church, if you win them to Christ, you get to baptize them. So
I don't know if that's why they have a lot of baptisms, and I don't know about the numbers of that. But let's just focus in on what he's talking about, the Great Commission, and saying that every Christian is to do that. I 100% believe that. All Baptists would agree with that everyone is to do that. But what he is saying is that teaching at the end of Matthew, for example, that teaching them to observe all things is the same as teaching in the context of the local church, or what we would describe as the preaching event on a Sunday morning. Not accurate. That's not how words work. We understand words based on the context. The context of the Great Commission is that everyone is supposed to go, and as you're going, that's as you are going. So as you're living your life, you are being a witness to the world of the gospel of Jesus Christ by sharing that gospel. And when you do that, you are making disciples, you are baptizing, you are teaching. But the idea there is that it's your everyday life. That's the context. It's not, hey, here's what it's like to be the church. And this means that you are supposed to do the teaching. Because even if you hold that, because it's really easy to point out like some of these words and just take a word out and say, here it is. I found the word in the context of both men and women using it and, going out and they're all supposed to be teaching. But when you do that, you're putting that in direct opposition to the Apostle Paul, because like he says, I know the Timothy passage. Well, there's several passages, but I think what he's really talking about is 1 Timothy chapter 2, that I do not permit a woman to teach. So if you're saying that teach always means preaching, like as in Sunday morning preaching, which is what he basically just said, then you're putting Jesus in opposition to Paul. Now, women are to preach, okay? Preach the gospel, because if you want to be like, okay, well, Mark says to preach to every living creature. So women are to preach, but does that mean teach in the context of the local church? That's the question.
Peter says, in the last days, I will pour out my spirit on all flesh. All flesh. Your sons and daughters will prophesy. That's different than the Old Testament. Russell, I've looked at over 300 commentaries on those verses, and it's interesting to me that almost everybody goes, "Yep."
Why do you have to do that all the time?
In the church, everybody gets to play, everybody gets to preach, everybody gets to prophesy, and the people who don't like that ignore that verse. John MacArthur doesn't even cover that verse. He just skips over it.
Shots fired.
And then the third thing that changed my mind. See, none of this had to do with culture. Had to do with scripture.
Okay, so before he gets into the third thing, let's talk about this. So he's talking about Acts chapter 2, the prophecy that I will pour out my spirit on all flesh, and your sons and your daughters will prophesy. So again, here's the thing, that Rick Warren is doing what a lot of egalitarians do, and I'm not saying that he's like firmly an egalitarian. I don't know exactly. I think he is, but I don't know. He doesn't come out and really just like say it in those kind of blunt terms. But what a lot of egalitarians do is that they just go, all right, here's teach here. Here's like a speaking moment. So preaching, prophesying, and that is what a pastor does on Sunday because it's public speaking. Again, context. Like the context isn't the local church. What's happening in Acts chapter 2 is not the local church. That is an evangelistic campaign. That is a fulfillment of the Great Commission that they are preaching. And he's talking about all flesh is going to get the Spirit. And then they're going to continue to prophesy. They're going to go and tell people about the gospel. So not every public speaking moment is what we see on a Sunday morning. So to equate these things, I don't think it makes sense. Now, I do think that this does, like if you're one of those people that are like, women can't do anything on a Sunday morning. They can't, like they're supposed to be 100% silent. And we'll get to that passage in a little bit. But if you're one of those people that they can't be a worship leader, they can't work with the kids, they can't teach in any way whatsoever. They can't be deaconesses, like go through the whole list. Women can't do any of that. I think that would fly in the face of that you'd have to deal with these scriptures because this is public speaking, prophesying and teaching. That is for everyone, men and women who are Christians. You are supposed to go and do these things. So that is true, but it is not the preaching event. That is different, and we'll take a look at that in a little bit.
And then all of a sudden, I noticed that the very first sermon, the very first Christian sermon, the message of the gospel of good news of the resurrection, Jesus chose a woman to deliver it to men. He had Mary Magdalene go and tell the disciples. Now, that clearly wasn't an accident. It was intentional. It's a whole new world, baby. Now he has a woman go tell the apostles. Can a woman teach an apostle? Evidently did it on the first day. He chose her to be the first preacher of the gospel.
I'm kind of giggling here because mostly because I think Rick Warren is saying these things as if it's a mic drop. Like, have you ever considered this? And it's like, but this isn't a solid argument. This is probably the weakest, I think, of all three. Is the transferring of facts now all preaching? What's happening in that moment is the transferring of a fact. Jesus has risen from the dead. Here's some news. It's not like they were like, let me give you three ideas about Jesus rising from the dead and what it means for you, Peter. No, they just went and said, hey, Jesus is alive. And they were like, what? And they start running, and John is way faster. Like that's what happens there. So this to me, I think, is the weakest of all of his points about female ordination, or the idea that a woman could be a pastor in a local church because they're preaching. So basically, he thinks that because they are called the same as men to preach the gospel in an evangelistic way through the Great Commission, that means that they're qualified to preach on a Sunday morning for the entire church. He also thinks that because they have the Spirit, and the prophecy is that all flesh will have the Spirit, so men and women. So therefore, they're qualified to preach on a Sunday morning for a local congregation. And then Mary and the women being the first heralds, if you will, of the gospel, in a way of saying that Jesus is risen from the dead. So now I want you to think about all three of those things and in the context, and realize that all of this is evangelism. Can we please just come to a firm understanding of that? Yes, of course, men and women are both called to do that. If you're a Christian, you are qualified to preach the gospel. But does preaching the gospel mean the same thing as what we see on a Sunday morning? No, because what we see on a Sunday morning is what we see throughout the epistles, mostly, of a qualified elder teaching the word to the people. Now, let's go to a couple passages, and then we'll look at what Ruslan has to say, why he thinks that it's a certain way. But let's look here. So this is 1 Timothy chapter 2. This would be one of those passages that Rick Warren said earlier, one of the Timothy passages, or the Timothy passage, I guess. So let's just read here, starting at verse 11. A woman is to learn quietly with full submission. I do not allow a woman to teach or to have authority over a man. Instead, she is to remain quiet. A lot of people will say that this means that they're supposed to shut up, and women are to be absolutely silent. But that's not what's being talked about here. The idea of this passage is focused on teaching. And so when it says that a woman is to remain silent in full submission, it means that she is not permitted to teach. She is not to be vocal. And the opposite of being vocal is being quiet. So they are to be quiet. But here's the thing. So are unqualified men. So are uncalled elders. they're like the people who think, oh, I know a lot of things, but they're not elders in their local church. They're supposed to be quiet too. So it's not just women who they're supposed to be quiet, and the focus is on, just the woman. The focus here is on authority. Now, who is allowed to have authority? The elders. Now, if you go to just, what comes next, you have to think about these letters in the idea of flowing thought, right? We don't have chapter breaks in these original letters on the papyrus. It wasn't like, let me put this verse and this verse and this verse next. No, it was just, here are all my thoughts on this. So with that in mind, we go from, all right, women are not allowed to teach, to what does it mean to teach, right? Because 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 1, this saying is trustworthy. If anyone aspires to be an overseer, he desires a noble work. An overseer, therefore, must be above reproach,
the husband of one wife,
self-controlled, sensible, respectable, hospitable, able to teach, not an excessive drinker, not a bully, but gentle. Let me read that a little bit louder for all the celebrity pastors. Not a bully, but gentle, not quarrelsome, not greedy. He must manage his own household competently and have his children under control with all dignity. If anyone does not know how to manage his own household, how will he take care of God's church? He must not be a new convert. Man, if only we could hold to these qualifications. Or he might become conceited and incur the same condemnation as the devil. Furthermore, he must have a good reputation among outsiders so that he does not fall into disgrace and the devil's trap. So these are the qualifications for an overseer. And the qualification is that he must be able to teach. Not that he must teach, but that he is able to teach, that he is a good teacher, that he knows his stuff, that he can communicate that message really well. You shouldn't have someone be called an overseer, and we'll get into that in a second. But this is the idea of being a pastor. And I do think that it's synonymous with pastor, elder, overseer, bishop. All these things are meaning the exact same office, because when you're doing that, you are leading your people, and part of leadership is teaching, and part of that teaching has authority. We just saw, I do not permit a woman to have authority over a man. So what would give a woman authority over that man? If they were to teach. And the reason why is because of this, because they're able to teach. These elders are able to teach. And when they do that, they're exercising spiritual authority. They're teaching people, they're leading people. People are relying on their teachings, and that is authoritative in their life. Now, this is the main difference between elders and deacons, because deacons have a lot of the same qualifications. Really, the only difference between elders and deacons in the qualifications is this idea of teaching. And so I think that is why elders are authoritative, is because they are authoritative when they're opening up the word of God for their people. And so if a woman was to do that, they would be exercising spiritual authority over a man. And God doesn't want it that way. Now, I used to hold to a stauncher view of this, and I got to be honest, my main reasoning, if anyone was to be like, hey, why did God set it up this way? Because he wanted to. That's the way he wants it. That's how I read the text. I think it's a clear implication of this text is that qualified men, not any man, qualified men are supposed to be the ones who are teaching on a regular basis within the context of the local church, not unqualified men, not random deacons. They're not supposed to have the authority. It is the elders, the qualified elders of that church who have the authority. Now, that excludes women. Now, when it comes to deaconesses, I think that there's a conversation that could be had, and I do believe that there is an office of deaconess, that they could be servants of the church in the same way that men can be servants of the church and fulfill that role of what we see in Acts chapter 6 or 7. I'm forgetting right now, but of serving the tables. I think that anyone can do that as long as they fit into the qualifications that are listed below. But I think the teaching role is reserved for those who are qualified according to this passage. Now, Ruslan had some interesting thoughts that I want to take a look at. All right, so before I press play on this thing, I don't want it to be like bashing Ruslan. I'm just going to be responding to some of the things that he says. So this isn't like a character assassination or anything like that. All right, let's watch this thing.
Here's every translation of it, right? And it says, so this is Ephesians 4. This is the roles of a church. So Christ himself gave the apostles, the prophets, the evangelists, the pastors, and teachers. And every one of these that you look at, it'll have some variation of that, okay? But this word pastors, okay, is actually, and the ESV does a good job of this, the shepherds. Okay, so the word pastor this is not the same word. You guys can fact check me on this. Go to the Hebrew, go to the Greek, go get the Blue Letter Study Bible. Go do it, do the research. Not the same word. That's not the same word that's in Titus. That's not the same word that's in 1 Timothy 3. Not the same word. This word is...
Okay, so he is trying to say that the 1 Timothy passage, that we just looked at of an overseer, that is different. And that's also what Paul says for Titus, because he was writing basically the same thing to Titus. So these young pastors, informing them what it looks like to be a qualified pastor or an overseer. Let's put it in that term for now. So what Ruslan is saying is that word is different, which he's right. It is a different Greek word than what we see with shepherd here. And so that's where he's building this momentum for his thought.
Shepherds. And when you look it up in the Greek, you'll see it all over the Bible that it's interchangeable. In the original Greek is the same word that Jesus is using when he says, I am the good shepherd. My sheep know my voice. Shepherd, shepherd, shepherd. So the word pastor that we see is used once in the entire New Testament for the word shepherd. Okay? Shepherd, pastor is not the same thing as elder, overseer.
So what Ruslan is trying to do, he's trying to make an argument that the idea of being a pastor is different than being the overseer. Like, so the 1 Timothy 3 passage and Titus passage, that's focused on an overseer, but Ephesians tells us that there are pastor teachers, which is really, when you get into the Greek, that's what it means. It's not pastors and like a completely different category teachers. These things are synonymous, that they're part of the same idea. This is shepherding people by teaching them. That could be anyone. That's what Ruslan is saying, that anyone can be a pastor, man or woman, but they cannot be the 1 Timothy 3 idea of an overseer. Now, the problem with that view is one particular passage, and I'm not sure if Ruslan is aware of it. I'm not throwing shade. I'm just reacting to what he said. But there's a passage that maybe he's not aware of, and maybe you aren't either. And that is 1 Peter chapter 5, which says, I exhort the elders among you as a fellow elder and witness to the sufferings of Christ, as well as one who shares in the glory about to be revealed. Shepherd God's flock among you, not overseeing out of compulsion, but willingly, as God would have you, not out of greed, but for money, but eagerly, not lording it over those entrusted to you, but being examples to the flock. And when the chief shepherd appears, you will receive the unfading crown of glory. In the same way, you who are younger, be subject to the elders. All of you clothe yourselves with humility toward one another, because God resists the proud, but gives grace to the humble. So I've highlighted a few words here, and you might recognize this one. This is the one that Ruslan was just talking about, of being a pastor, being a shepherd. But notice, again, what's happening here. So this is Peter talking and saying, I exhort the elders among you as a fellow elder and witness to the sufferings of Christ, as well as the one who shares in the glory about to be revealed. Shepherd God's flock among you, not overseeing. This is the word that we see in 1 Timothy chapter 3 and in Titus. This is the idea of being that overseer with all the qualifications that are attached. And what you can see pretty clearly here is that all three of these words, elders, shepherds, overseers, are all synonymous. It's all the same role. I exhort the elders to shepherd, not overseeing out of compulsion. Like, all of these ideas are talking about one office, and that makes sense because we have one list of qualifications. So to kind of land this plane, I'll just say a few things. Rick Warren's wrong on his view about female pastors. Those arguments that he makes, I think, are very clearly about evangelism and really nothing to do with what happens inside the local church. And it's totally divorced from any of the qualifications in 1 Timothy chapter 3. I also think that Ruslan is wrong on this one. That's my opinion. All right. I know I got a lot of egalitarians who watch this and people from different perspectives. So I'm just giving my thoughts. That's why I have this YouTube channel, is to share my thoughts on things. So if you disagree, that's fine. But I would disagree with Ruslan on this thing and say that, no, I think 1 Peter is pretty clear that elders are overseers and overseers are shepherds. So anyone who would claim any of these roles has to fit the qualifications of 1 Timothy chapter 3, which I think would be very against female pastors, because you can't be the husband of one wife, and then you also have to wrestle with the 1 Timothy 2 passage. So there's just a lot. There's a lot there that if you're going to try to climb that mountain of saying like women can be pastors, there's a lot of things that you're going to have to figure out. And for me, I can't get past these things. I would love to be able to, roll with culture and just be able to say like, yeah, everyone's the same. It's all fine. And there isn't any tension here. There's some tension here. There are some things that are uncomfortable about this conversation. But just because it's uncomfortable doesn't make it untrue. And so when I look at these passages, that's where I come out. And I think that's actually the soft complementarian role, because I do think that women can be deaconess, that they can be servants in the church. I think that there are many opportunities that women can have within the local church, even speaking engagements, being able to go and speak at various events and all of that, and teach in a mixed audience. I think that's possible. But that being said, what happens on the Sunday morning in the corporate worship with the elders opening up the Word of God, I think that they have to be qualified according to 1 Timothy chapter 3. That's me. Let me know what you think about all of this down in the comments section. I'm sure there are going to be tons of different perspectives because, a lot of different kinds of people watch my videos, and I respect your opinion. I'm just saying this one's mine, and I'll see you in the next one.